19BBY. The Separatist flagship Invisible Hand, in orbit above Coruscant. The battle below is still raging. Republic cruisers and Separatist frigates exchanging fire across low orbit, the capital's sky fracturing with light. Inside the observation deck, Count Dooku stands in the near silence that follows complete victory, both lightsabers still warm in his hands. Obi-Wan Kenobi is unconscious on the floor. Anakin Skywalker is disarmed, kneeling at his feet. Dooku has just defeated two of the Jedi Order's finest in succession, which, if you have followed his career, isn't surprising. He is Yan Dooku of Serenno, Darth Tyranus, Dark Lord of the Sith, formerly the 20th Jedi Master in recorded history to voluntarily resign from the Order, trained by Yoda himself, a practitioner the Order recognized as among the most gifted of any generation. He has been doing this for a very long time. He turns toward the chair where Chancellor Palpatine sits, wrists bound, helpless, the picture of a frail old man about to be rescued by his most trusted instrument, his oldest ally. The man who, for 13 years, has been the load-bearing structure of everything Dooku has built since leaving the Jedi. Palpatine speaks. He tells Anakin to kill him. Not the Jedi on the floor. Him. Dooku. What happens over the next 4 seconds is the pivot point of one of the most sophisticated long cons in the history of the saga. Dooku drops both lightsabers. He doesn't run, doesn't channel the Force, doesn't bargain. He simply stops. Not in the manner of someone who has calculated their options and found none viable, but in the specific way that happens when a model of reality collapses faster than the mind can rebuild it. Christopher Lee's face across those 4 seconds isn't a performance of defeat. It's the expression of a man encountering a fact structurally incompatible with everything he believes about his place in the world. He was right about the Jedi Council, right about the Republic's corruption, right about every institutional failure he had spent decades documenting with the precision of a man who had been inside the institution and understood exactly how it worked. And for 13 years, the one person who had confirmed he was right, the foundational relationship of his entire post-Jedi existence, had been running a parallel operation, one that was always designed to end with exactly this sentence and exactly this audience. Count Dooku never suspected Palpatine would replace him. Not once. This is the case for why. A quick sourcing note, because the territory matters and getting it wrong matters more. This script draws from Disney canon, the prequel films, the Clone Wars animated series, Cavan Scott's audio drama Dooku, Jedi Lost, and Matthew Stover's Revenge of the Sith novelization, and from the pre-Disney Legends continuity, where flagged. The Battle of Galadron is Legends only, originating in Hayden Blackman's 2002 comic series Jango Fett, Open Seasons. Everything else will be identified when it appears. Now, the case. Yan Dooku was born on Serenno, a planet governed by hereditary aristocracy, old houses, old land, old authority of the kind that has never needed to raise its voice because it has never been seriously challenged. His family held the title of Count. As a child, Force-sensitive and identified as such, he was taken from Serenno by the Jedi Order, which was standard practice across the Republic era. His family's title waited for him throughout his entire Jedi career, patient as stone, as if it had always known he would eventually come back to claim it. He trained under Yoda. He rose to Jedi Master, recognized across the Order as one of the most gifted practitioners of his generation. He trained his own Padawans, Rael Averross first, and then Qui-Gon Jinn, the man who would go on to discover Anakin Skywalker on Tatooine and die on Naboo before the Council ever understood what he'd been trying to tell them. The lineage Dooku anchors runs directly from Yoda through Dooku, through Qui-Gon, through Obi-Wan to Anakin. Every catastrophe that follows in the Skywalker saga has its structural root somewhere in that chain. The first person in that lineage to say something is fundamentally wrong with this institution was Dooku. In 42 BBY, he formally resigned. The archives designated him the 20th member of the Lost 20, a precise and deliberately maintained count of Jedi Masters who, across the entire recorded history of the Order, had voluntarily walked away over matters of principle. Not expelled for misconduct, not killed in service, not lapsed into inactivity. 20 individuals who examined the institution they had served and chose, of their own volition, to be finished with it. The Jedi kept holocron likenesses of every single one of them in the archives. That archival decision tells you something real about institutional psychology. An organization documents its principled departures when those departures can't be refuted on the merits, when dismissing them would require dismissing the accurate diagnosis they carried out the door. The lost 20 weren't embarrassments to be purged from the record. They were 20 wounds kept visible, perhaps because not keeping them visible would make future wounds impossible to understand when they arrived. Dooku was number 20. The count had been climbing for thousands of years. He returned to Serenno, reclaimed the count's title, stepped back into the aristocratic identity the Order had asked him to set aside when he was a child, and that he had never fully relinquished internally. From Serenno's ancestral seat, with a senior insider's structural understanding of the Jedi Order and an outsider's distance from its institutional pressures, he began watching the Republic with the quality of attention that is only possible when you are no longer required to defend what you observe. What he saw wasn't ambiguous. The Revenge of the Sith novelization, written from a perspective essentially sympathetic to the Republic, published the same year as the film in which Dooku functions as the opening act villain, describes him as known for his integrity, his principled stand against what he sees as corruption in the Senate. Enemies of the Republic acknowledged the diagnosis. They disputed the remedy. But the diagnosis itself was sound, and the charges in Dooku's case file against the Jedi Council, assembled across decades of direct observation, are serious enough to take seriously. Charge 1. The institutional silencing of accurate foresight. Sifo Dyas was a Jedi Master, a contemporary of Dooku, a man they had shared at least one mission with on Serenno. He was receiving force visions of catastrophic incoming conflict, a war on a scale the Republic had not mobilized for in living memory. He brought those visions to the Council. In the Legends continuity, Sifo Dyas had actually served on the High Council itself, before being removed because his ideas were considered too extreme. In Disney canon, the exact mechanism is less clearly defined. Dismissal rather than active suppression is the more accurate characterization. But the outcome in both continuities is identical. The Council didn't act on what Sifo Dyas was seeing. He went ahead without authorization. He traveled to Kamino and commissioned a clone army from the Kaminoan government, an act of unilateral, force-guided judgment in direct defiance of Council authority. He was right about the coming war. He was killed, with Dooku eventually serving as the instrument of that killing, under Palpatine's direction. The army Sifo Dyas had commissioned in secret became the Republic's only military force when the conflict his visions had predicted finally arrived. His identity was used posthumously, by the conspiracy that had murdered him, to authorize the operation his murder had enabled. Dooku had known Sifo Dyas personally, had traveled with him. The fate of a Jedi who tells the Council what it doesn't want to hear, acts unilaterally on a correct prediction, and is eventually killed for the trouble wasn't an abstract object lesson. It was the story of a colleague. Charge 2. The systematic marginalization of independent genius. Qui-Gon Jinn was Dooku's most celebrated student. By the time of the Phantom Menace, he was one of the most perceptive Jedi alive, the one practitioner who correctly identified Anakin Skywalker as the Chosen One, before the Council was prepared to entertain the possibility. The one Jedi whose understanding of the living force consistently exceeded what the institution was willing to formally acknowledge. Qui-Gon was offered a seat on the Jedi Council and declined it. He trusted his own judgment over Council doctrine, repeatedly and publicly, and was correct about it repeatedly and publicly, playing by his own rules and remaining outside the institution's authority structure, rather than inside it on terms that constrained what he could say and do. He won arguments by being right, and his answer to that was continued independence. Dooku had built this man from a Padawan. He recognized in Qui-Gon the specific quality the Order spent its institutional energy managing: the willingness to trust what was actually in front of you, rather than what the Council needed you to see. Qui-Gon's refusal of the Council seat told Dooku something real about what his most celebrated student thought of institutional authority, and the Order's complicated relationship with exactly this quality of independence confirmed what Dooku had already concluded. The Order had identified accuracy in service of inconvenient truth as something to be contained rather than elevated. When Darth Maul killed Qui-Gon on Naboo in 32 BBY, a decade after Dooku had already resigned, what Dooku felt included documented anger at the Council for ignoring Qui-Gon's repeated warnings about Sith activity. The most accurate living reader of Force-sensitive threats had been treated as an eccentric maverick throughout his career, his warnings filed and not actioned, until the threat materialized and killed him on a planet the Council had dispatched him to without adequate intelligence or support. Qui-Gon's death didn't trigger Dooku's departure. He was gone by 10 years at that point, but it confirmed everything he had already concluded about the institution he had left. Charge 3. Political capture disguised as institutional independence. By the prequel era, the Jedi Order was functioning as something its ancient mandate never described: a paramilitary enforcement arm of the Senate, deployed to resolve trade disputes, suppress planetary unrest, and maintain the specific variety of peace that primarily served Senate interests. An institution that claims independence from the political body while being routinely deployed by that body isn't above politics. It's captured by politics, the worst variety of capture, because from the inside, each individual deployment seems reasonable in isolation. The pattern only becomes visible from outside, when you can see the accumulated total of what the Order is actually being used for, and by whom. Dooku, watching from Serenno, could see the pattern. Now the Legends flag goes up, clearly and deliberately. The Battle of Galadron does not exist in Disney canon. It originates entirely in Jango Fett, Open Seasons, Hayden Blackman's comic series published from May to September 2002. What it depicts, in the Legends continuity, is the most concentrated single illustration in any Star Wars material of the institutional rot Dooku had been cataloging across his entire career. A planetary governor on Galadron, a world of snow-capped mountains and large pine forests, its ruling seat a castle by any measure opulent, fabricated intelligence and delivered it to the Jedi Council. His claim? True Mandalorian warriors operating on his planet were terrorists responsible for mass political killings. The Council deployed a Jedi team to respond. Dooku led it. His Padawan at the time was Kamari Vosa. The Jedi attacked the Mandalorians on the basis of a governor's fabricated report without independent verification, and killed nearly all of them. One man survived, Jango Fett, a name that would accumulate considerable historical weight in the years to come, in projects Dooku himself would eventually organize. The governor who manufactured the intelligence faced no Jedi accountability. The Council absorbed what had happened without formal consequence. No inquiry, no institutional reckoning, no acknowledgement that the Order had been weaponized by a corrupt official's private interests. Dooku had personally led the operation. He had carried out the massacre with his own hands. The institution he served processed the atrocity by not processing it at all, and Dooku was left holding what had happened with no framework for understanding it that the Order was willing to provide. An organization that can't face its own complicity in an atrocity can't credibly hold anyone else accountable for anything. In the Legends continuity, Galadron left a mark on Dooku that deepened everything. Not because it made him suddenly evil, but because it demonstrated, at close range and in blood, that the institution's response to being used as an instrument of injustice was silence. That is the prosecution. Sifo Dyas, accurate and killed for the trouble. Qui-Gon Jinn, exceptional and operating outside institutional authority by his own choice. An Order deployed as a Senate instrument while presenting itself as independent. And, in Legends, the massacre at Galadron with no institutional reckoning whatsoever. These are specific, documented, named institutional failures accumulated by one of the Order's most senior and perceptive members across decades of direct observation. The case file is real, which is precisely what made Dooku the ideal instrument for someone who had been reading that file carefully for years. Senator Palpatine of Naboo wasn't a man who waited for opportunities to present themselves. He manufactured them at range, over timelines measured in decades, and he began his work on Dooku before the resignation was even formalized. The canon novel Master and Apprentice, set approximately 8 years before The Phantom Menace, placing it around 40 BBY, just after Dooku's departure from the Order, establishes him already working with Palpatine. The contact preceded the formal break. Palpatine was already present, already building the relationship, while Dooku was still technically a Jedi Master. What Palpatine offered in those early conversations wasn't power. Dooku had power. He had Serenno's hereditary wealth, political connections spanning the Outer Rim, and a reputation for integrity earned rather than manufactured. What no one in his life had provided, across decades in an institution that had repeatedly absorbed his most accurate observations with careful, empty non-response, was a peer who would engage the substance of what he was saying and confirm it as correct. The Council's pattern across every significant disagreement had been some version of, "Noted, Master Dooku. Your perspective has been heard. The matter is under review." And then nothing changed. Palpatine's pattern was structurally opposite. He agreed with Dooku's diagnosis of the Senate, specifically and in detail. He agreed the Jedi had become the Senate's enforcement mechanism, and named the precise ways in which that capture operated. He agreed the Republic's institutions were failing the people they claimed to serve, and engaged the mechanisms of that failure with the analytical precision of a man who had been observing them from inside the political structure for his entire career. He didn't manage Dooku's analysis, he matched it. Multiple sources describe the relationship's evolution: shared diagnosis of institutional failure, honest conversation about what a corrected galactic order might look like, agreement on a vision that went beyond what either man could achieve within existing power structures. Their conversations deepened over time into each man honestly revealing his true goals for the galaxy. This wasn't Palpatine flattering Dooku. Flattery is vague. It tells you that you're important without engaging the substance of what makes you important. What Palpatine was offering was the specific experience of being engaged at full depth by someone who appeared to have done the same intellectual work from a different vantage point and arrived at the same conclusions. For a man of Dooku's intelligence and pride, after years of being the most perceptive senior member of an institution whose response to perception was institutional management, that experience wasn't a minor comfort. It was the specific thing that had been withheld every time it mattered most. Sifo Dyas dismissed, Qui-Gon sidelined, Galadron unaddressed, and now, finally, someone whose response to Dooku's observations wasn't careful institutional language, but something that functioned like recognition. Yes, that is exactly what I see too, and I have been watching it from my side for longer than either of us has been comfortable saying. When Palpatine revealed himself as Darth Sidious, after Darth Maul's apparent death on Naboo in 32 BBY, Dooku's documented response wasn't shock, and not the experience of having been deceived. The account that best captures the moment describes Dooku finding that the goal he and Senator Palpatine had been working toward was still the same goal Darth Sidious was pursuing. The revelation didn't change the destination. It named the vehicle. A confidence operation that feels like a trap at the moment of unmasking has failed. One that feels like completion at that moment has succeeded at the deepest possible level. Dooku didn't experience learning that his closest ally was a Sith Lord as betrayal. He experienced it as the final piece of a picture he had already mostly assembled, which tells you exactly how comprehensively the setup had worked. Darth Maul was bisected by Obi-Wan Kenobi in the reactor shaft below Theed Palace, dropped into the shaft's depths, and presumed dead. He had been Palpatine's first apprentice, raw, brutal combat capacity suited to the earliest operational phase. Enforcement, assassination, the work of a precision weapon rather than a strategist. The rule of two had, in a single duel, produced a vacancy. Dooku filled it. He took the name Darth Tyranus and began constructing the apparatus that would produce a galaxy-wide war. He deleted Kamino's coordinates from the Jedi archives, a single, targeted act of sabotage that kept the Republic ignorant of its own clone army for nearly a decade, hiding the discovery behind an absence of information rather than a wall of false information. He hired Jango Fett as the genetic template for those clones, commissioning the army through the dead Sifo Dyas's identity, the Jedi whose accurate visions had been dismissed, whose unauthorized action in commissioning the army had led to his murder, now serving posthumously as the official authorization for the operation his killing had enabled. In the Legends continuity, the Jango Fett selection carries an additional layer. Jango Fett was the sole survivor of the massacre at Galadron, the one Mandalorian who had walked away from the engagement Dooku had personally led. Now Fett served as the most consequential military contractor in galactic history, the organization being built by the same man who had commanded that mission. Both men knew exactly who the other was. On Geonosis, with Obi-Wan Kenobi as his prisoner, Dooku told the captured Jedi that a Sith Lord had infiltrated the Senate. The information was true. On the surface, it reads as a moment of dangerous candor, Dooku risking his master's exposure to warn a former Jedi of a genuine conspiracy. It was precisely calibrated misdirection. Palpatine had designed this moment, release a true fact in a form diffuse enough to generate investigation without enabling accurate identification. The Jedi would search for a Sith in the Senate's ranks and find shadows everywhere, because they were looking for someone they didn't already know and trust. They wouldn't look at the Chancellor's office, because the Chancellor was who they had been deployed to rescue. Dooku was functioning as misdirection in his most apparently authentic moment, and nothing in the available sources suggests he understood that's what he was doing. He believed he was a partner communicating at some personal risk. He was a piece being moved. Christopher Lee was 80 years old when Attack of the Clones premiered in May 2002. He had been working since the late 1940s, more than 200 film credits across 6 decades. Hammer Horror's definitive Dracula across a run of films that defined a genre. Francisco Scaramanga in The Man with the Golden Gun. Saruman across Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings. A career in villain and authority roles so extensive and so consistent that by the time Lucas cast him, Lee had spent 60 years inhabiting formidable, complicated, intellectually authoritative men, until the quality had ceased to be something he performed and had become structural. He had served with Britain's Special Operations Executive during the Second World War, the details of which he declined to discuss fully in any interview, which itself told you something about the weight of that experience. He spoke multiple languages. He released a symphonic metal concept album at 91. By the time he walked onto a Geonosian set to deliver lines like a man who had never once been impressed by anything in any room he had ever entered, Christopher Lee had been exactly this kind of man, in exactly this register, for longer than most of his audience had been alive. What he brought to Dooku was weight that no screenplay could have generated from scratch. When Lee addressed the assembled Jedi in the Geonosian arena with serene, almost gentle contempt, the scene worked not because the dialogue compelled it, but because 60 years of cinema had trained audiences to recognize what genuine authority looks like, and Lee wore it without effort or announcement. His height, his voice's precise calibration between warmth and cold precision, the unhurried completeness of each gesture, these made Dooku's aristocratic lethality feel earned rather than scripted. You understood immediately that this man had been exactly this dangerous for an extremely long time, and that nothing happening in the scene was surprising him. He died in June 2015. He was 93. The Star Wars community's grief for Christopher Lee was inseparable from its grief for Dooku as a character, and that inseparability tells you something real about what the performance had achieved. The two losses collapsed into one, because Lee had made Dooku's dignity, his tragedy, his particular mode of principled self-destruction, feel continuous with a real human life of genuine consequence and complexity. What the text alone couldn't have made fully resonant, Lee made inevitable. Watch the execution scene knowing everything this script has been building. The incomprehension in Lee's face across those 4 seconds isn't only a character responding to betrayal. It's an 80-year-old man with 60 years of experience playing formidable figures, arriving at the moment where his character's entire construction of reality is falsified in a single sentence, and rendering that collapse with a precision that required exactly his specific biography to achieve. Any serious examination of Dooku that doesn't include Christopher Lee at its center is examining an outline. The Clone Wars animated series, Disney canon throughout, gave Dooku something the film's runtime couldn't accommodate: room to be contradictory, menacing, and capable of something approaching genuine investment in the people around him across multiple seasons of sustained characterization. And in seasons 3 and 4, it stages something that functions in retrospect as the most concentrated evidence of the blind spot that would eventually kill him. His apprentice was Asajj Ventress, a Dathomirian warrior trained by Dooku as his personal assassin and combat specialist over years of Clone Wars service. She was exceptional, dangerous in the specific way that the most capable people always are, accumulating ability at a rate that eventually attracts the attention of anyone tracking the balance of power. Dooku's intent with Ventress, documented in the series, extended beyond immediate tactical utility. He was training her toward the day she might become powerful enough to help him challenge Sidious directly. His loyalty to Palpatine's operational plan coexisted with a private, ongoing calculation. Cultivate the apprentice capable of taking the next step. Use the apprentice against the master when the moment is right. He was seeking, in other words, a tool suited to the phase after the current phase, exactly the way Palpatine had identified and cultivated him. Palpatine registered the accumulating threat and issued a single instruction. Dooku was to eliminate Ventress. A second apprentice strong enough to threaten the hierarchy wasn't something Sidious would accommodate. The same logic that had governed the rule of 2 since its founding applied here with full force. The order came, and Dooku complied. He sent a fleet to Dathomir. He tried to have her killed, not because she had failed him or betrayed him, but because her master had determined she was no longer an asset and had become a liability, and Dooku's role in that determination was to be the instrument of its execution. Ventress survived. She cut herself free of Dooku's world and became a mercenary, eventually a bounty hunter, a woman whose life after Dooku was defined entirely by the moment her master decided she was inconvenient and acted on it. Dooku did to Ventress exactly what Palpatine would eventually do to him. He received an order to eliminate an apprentice who had become a structural inconvenience to his master's continued control, and he obeyed, without any canon moment of pausing to trace the structural logic back to his own position. Beyond that, his private endgame had always involved finding an apprentice capable of eventually overthrowing the master above him. He understood that the relationship between Sith master and apprentice contains an inherent succession problem. He was actively preparing to exploit that problem upward against Palpatine. He apparently never asked whether Palpatine was working the same angle downward against him, on a longer timeline and with considerably more patience. After Ventress, he worked with Savage Opress, another search for the eventual weapon against his master. The pattern continued. The inverse logic never completed. The explanation for the blind spot is grounded in the specific architecture of Dooku's relationship with Palpatine. Palpatine wasn't simply his Sith master. He was the foundational relationship of his entire post-Jedi existence, the person whose sustained engagement with Dooku's analysis had made every decision since 42 BBY coherent and purposeful. To seriously entertain the possibility that Palpatine considered him temporary wasn't a thought that could exist in isolation. It would require reopening every decision of the past 13 years and asking whether any of it had been executed inside Palpatine's design rather than Dooku's own. For a man of Dooku's pride, whose self-understanding was built partly on the correctness of his analysis and the authenticity of the validation he had received for it, that question apparently couldn't complete. While Dooku served and trained and quietly cultivated candidates who might one day help him challenge his master, Palpatine was operating on someone else entirely. In 32 BBY, the same year Palpatine revealed himself to Dooku as Darth Sidious, the same year Maul fell on Naboo, a 9-year-old boy named Anakin Skywalker arrived on Coruscant from Tatooine, with a midi-chlorian count that exceeded every recorded measurement in the Order's history, and a mother he had just been permanently separated from. The Jedi Council evaluated him, debated him, initially rejected him on the grounds that he was too old and carried too much fear. They agreed to his training only after Qui-Gon Jinn died on Naboo requesting it, capitulating, after years of dismissing Qui-Gon's judgment, to his final wish. Palpatine began his work on Anakin that same year. For 13 years, across the Clone Wars and the years that preceded them, he was the authority in Anakin's life who didn't require emotional detachment as the price of closeness. The Jedi Order's response to Anakin's fears, particularly his terror of losing the people he loved, was doctrinal correction. Attachment is forbidden, the Council told him consistently. Fear of loss is the path toward the dark side. These feelings must be managed, then eliminated. Palpatine's response was to listen, to acknowledge that what Anakin felt was real, and to position himself as the one paternal figure who loved Anakin without institutional conditions attached to that love. The manipulation of Anakin differed significantly in texture from the manipulation of Dooku. Dooku needed intellectual engagement, a peer who could match his analytical depth and confirm his conclusions as correct. Anakin needed emotional permission, someone who validated his experience rather than pathologizing it. But the underlying structure of both operations was identical. Find the wound the institution has been making worse. Become the one relationship in the target's life that does not compound it. Allow the dependency to develop across enough time that the eventual steering registers as kindness rather than management. Both operations ran simultaneously throughout the Clone Wars. Dooku believed the plan was approaching its conclusion, Grievous absorbing the war's atrocities, Dooku stepping out of Darth Tyranus and back into Count Dooku, the principled reformer, the new order being built from a foundation of his intact reputation and Palpatine's political authority. From Dooku's vantage point, he had been a partner in this design for 13 years, and the endgame was finally close. From Palpatine's accounting, the endgame was also approaching. Dooku wasn't in it. Before the invisible hand, a charge that deserves to be made seriously and without dismissal. The counter-argument is this: Dooku's grievances didn't cause his fall. They gave it a moral architecture he could inhabit with conviction, but the predisposition came first. The arrogance was structural and prior, embedded in who he was before the Council ever gave him a legitimate reason to criticize it. A man born into centuries of Serenno's hereditary authority, placed in an egalitarian organization that treated all voices as having equivalent weight, and who never fully accepted that framework despite decades of institutional membership. That man was always going to reach a breaking point, because the Order and his self-conception were in long-term conflict that only one of them was going to win. The evidence for this reading is documented. Multiple sources identify Dooku's arrogance and sense of superiority as character flaws rooted explicitly in his aristocratic background. Look at his behavior during the Clone Wars, the sustained contempt for General Grievous, whom he used and scorned simultaneously, as though utility and respect were categories that couldn't coexist in his understanding of subordinates. The clinical compliance with Palpatine's order to eliminate Ventress, executed without apparent moral crisis about an apprentice he had trained across years of close collaboration. These aren't the behaviors of a man motivated primarily by justice and institutional accountability. They are the behaviors of someone who has always divided the world into the exceptional and the expendable, and who never seriously interrogated which category applied to himself. When Dooku returned to Serenno and reclaimed the Count's title after his resignation, he wasn't only a principled reformer rejecting a corrupt institution. He was stepping back into the identity the Order had asked him to set aside when he was a child: hereditary rule, inherited authority, a social order where his family had always been at the top. The Jedi identity had been sitting on top of the Serenno identity for decades. When he removed it, What remained was what you'd expect. So, were Dooku's grievances reasons for his fall, or excuses he was already seeking? The honest answer is that the binary is false, and Palpatine's specific genius was recognizing that before Dooku did. Legitimate grievances gave Dooku's fall a moral architecture he could inhabit with genuine sincerity. He wasn't performing his convictions, he believed them, because they were largely correct. The aristocratic pride made him resistant to the self-interrogation that might have revealed the manipulation. Having both at once, real wounds plus the absolute certainty that his analysis of those wounds was unimpeachable, meant each reinforced the other in a loop a purely principled man or a purely ambitious one might have escaped earlier. A purely principled man might have asked whether his allies shared his principles or merely his conclusions. A purely cynical man might have remained skeptical about the depth of any alliance. Dooku was neither, and the specific combination of those two things made him, for Palpatine's purposes, exactly the instrument the plan required. 19 BBY, the invisible hand, the moment the entire script has been building toward. The available reconstruction of what Dooku expected going into the Battle of Coruscant points consistently in one direction. He understood, at the strategic level, that the war was approaching its conclusion. Grievous would carry the conflict's atrocities into the historical record. 3 years of scorched planets, civilian casualties, the systematic violence of a droid army, and bear that weight as the war's visible face. Dooku would step out of Darth Tyranus and back into Count Dooku, the principled statesman whose reputation for integrity had been maintained carefully and deliberately throughout, because he would need it afterward. The new order would be constructed from that foundation, and Dooku's position within it wasn't something he doubted. One source captures Dooku's reported understanding at this stage. Sidious had told him the plan extended beyond the duel, with Grievous absorbing the war's crimes, while Dooku emerged as the political architect of what came next. He walked onto that flagship believing the final phase was beginning. He fought Obi-Wan Kenobi and won. He fought Anakin Skywalker. And there is a reading, consistent with the scene's staging and Dooku's documented understanding of his master's long-term interests, that the duel functioned partly as an evaluation of Anakin's readiness for whatever came next in the plan. If Dooku understood it that way, he also apparently believed he would survive the evaluation. His operational value across 13 years was comprehensive and irreplaceable. The Camino Commission, the Separatist movement's political architecture, the clone army framework, the Geonosis misdirection, the deletion of the archive's coordinates. You don't reach the end of a 13-year construction project and remove the man who built it. Anakin bested him, both sabers down, on his knees, looking up at the chair where Palpatine sat, bound and utterly helpless, waiting for rescue from his oldest partner. Palpatine told Anakin to execute the man kneeling before him. The sources confirm what Lee's face shows. Dooku was visibly surprised. Genuinely so, not braced or resigned. His model of his relationship with Palpatine, the foundational structure of everything he had done since 42 BBY, the single relationship that had given his post-Jedi existence its coherence and purpose, was falsified in one sentence, and he had seconds to understand what that meant before understanding became unavailable. He said nothing. He didn't warn Anakin. He didn't attempt to reveal Palpatine's identity or explain what Anakin was being maneuvered into. There was no final act of conscience. The sourced explanations for this are consistent. He was exhausted, disarmed, and operating on a cognitive framework that had just collapsed entirely. He was gone before comprehension could complete. Palpatine offered Anakin Dooku's position before the scene had ended. Darth Maul had been the first, raw combat power suited to the plan's opening phase. Dooku, as Darth Tyranus, had been the second, political credibility and organizational genius suited to the construction phase. Anakin would be the third, physical devastation and psychological devastation in equal measure, suited to the final phase, the systematic destruction of the Jedi Order and the consolidation of imperial authority. Each apprentice was the right instrument for a specific historical moment. Each was designed to be removed when that moment passed. From Palpatine's accounting, the succession had always been a blueprint, not a series of improvisations. Dooku was a bridge between phases, not a destination in his own right. Whether any honest word ever passed between them across 13 years, whether the validation Palpatine offered was genuine engagement or precise performance of engagement, no source can definitively answer. What every available source confirms is that Dooku never suspected the answer was the latter. Not when Palpatine first engaged his frustrations before his formal resignation. Not when the revelation of Sidious felt like completion rather than exposure. Not when he complied with the order to kill Ventress and didn't trace the structural logic back to his own position. Not on the morning of the Battle of Coruscant. Not once. Anakin Skywalker's fall is a story of false hope. The promise that power over death could be acquired if the right alliances were made and the right moves taken at the right moment. Dooku's fall is something different, and in certain ways, harder to look at directly. He wasn't promised the impossible. He was given the real. The Jedi Council's failures were actual failures. The Senate's corruption was actual corruption. The Republic's institutional rot was diagnosed correctly, with specificity and evidence, by a man who had the access, the seniority, and the analytical capacity to read it clearly across decades. Palpatine didn't need to manufacture Dooku's grievances. He only needed to be the one person in the galaxy who didn't explain them away. The intelligence that let Dooku see every structural failure around him was the same intelligence that built increasingly elaborate justifications for why the relationship providing his validation was genuine. The long and accurate track record, and the pride that came with it, made the idea of seriously interrogating his primary validator not just uncomfortable, but nearly structurally impossible, because the validator and the validated analysis were bundled together in the same cognitive architecture. To question one was to destabilize the other. And a man who has been right about institutional failures for decades, who has been building a case that history has largely confirmed, does not easily sit with the possibility that the one person confirming his case has been running him the entire time. Dooku correctly diagnosed the Jedi Order, correctly diagnosed the Republic, was right about nearly every institutional failure he had ever named, and history proved him correct on most of them. He was used precisely because of that diagnostic genius, used, sustained across 13 years, and eventually discarded with the same calm efficiency he himself had brought to discarding Asajj Ventress when his master required it. The pattern he enacted on her was the pattern being enacted on him. He never saw it. The tragedy isn't that Dooku was wrong. It's that he was right, and that was all Palpatine needed. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe.